Story 1. The House on Millfield Road. Deputy Aaron Sykes had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Office for 11 years. He'd seen car accidents bad enough to make grown men weep on the side of the road. He'd delivered death notifications to mothers, to fathers, to children old enough to understand what it meant when a deputy showed up at the door at 2 a.m. He thought, after 11 years, that he had developed a kind of armor. Not indifference exactly, but a professional distance that kept the worst of it from getting too deep inside him. He was wrong. The call came in on a Tuesday night in late October. A neighbor on Millfield Road had reported a strange smell coming from the house next door, a rental property that had been occupied for about 8 months by a man named Gerald Mast, mid-50s, who mostly kept to himself. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Ruth Calloway, told the dispatcher she hadn't seen Gerald in maybe 3 weeks. His car was still in the driveway. His porch light had been on continuously. And the smell, she described it as sweet and wrong, like fruit that had gone far past rotten. Aaron knew what that smell was before he even got out of the cruiser. He and his partner, Deputy Leanne Marsh, approached the front door. The porch light buzzed overhead, the bulb old and flickering. Aaron knocked and announced, "Nothing." He tried the door, unlocked. He pushed it open, and the smell hit them both like a physical force. Leanne gagged and stepped back. Aaron held his breath, clicked on his flashlight, and stepped inside. The living room looked almost normal at first. A couch with an Afghan draped over the armrest, a television, a coffee table with a mug on it. But there was a layer of flies on every surface. Not buzzing, just resting, moving slowly in the beam of his flashlight, like a dark, twitching carpet. Thousands of them. He called out again. No answer. He moved toward the hallway. The smell intensified with every step. He found Gerald Mast in the back bedroom, or what remained of him. He had been dead for somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks, based on what the medical examiner later determined. Aaron did not allow himself to process what he was seeing, not then. He backed out of the room, told Leanne to call it in, and went to stand on the front lawn, where he breathed through his mouth and stared at the sky. Like that should have been the end of it. A man had died alone. It happened more than people like to think about. Aaron had handled it before. But when the crime scene technicians arrived and began their work, they found something that turned a routine death investigation into something none of them had a name for. In the closet of the back bedroom, behind Gerald Mast's hanging clothes, there was a door. Not a closet within a closet. A real door. Full-sized. That had been papered over and painted to match the wall at some point in the past, then cut back open more recently. Someone had scored around the frame with a utility knife and peeled the drywall away. The hinges had been re-oiled. The door opened onto a narrow staircase leading down into a basement that did not appear on any of the building records for the property. The technicians documented it first. Then Aaron and Leanne descended. In the basement was a single large room with a concrete floor and bare cinder block walls. It was lit by a string of LED shop lights running along the ceiling, connected to a power strip plugged into an extension cord that ran up through a hole in the floor above. The lights were still on. They had presumably been on for the entire 3 weeks Gerald had been dead. Along one wall was a folding table covered in notebooks, composition books, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore. Dozens of them, each one labeled on the cover with a date range, written in small, precise handwriting. Along the opposite wall was a cot with a sleeping bag and a plastic storage bin that contained several weeks' worth of canned food, bottled water, and a hand crank flashlight. There was a chemical toilet in the corner. Someone had been living down there, or prepared to live down there, or both. The notebooks were what disturbed Aaron most, and he wasn't supposed to read them. That was for detectives, and eventually the DA if it came to that. But he saw enough before he was moved out of the basement to understand the general shape of what they contained. Gerald Mast had been watching someone, for years based on the dates on the notebooks, watching them with a level of detail and patience that suggested not obsession in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and more deliberate, a methodical, almost bureaucratic attention to another person's life. The entries described routines, schedules, physical descriptions, the contents of trash bags left at the curb. There were pages of what appeared to be transcriptions of phone calls. There were photographs tucked into the back covers of several notebooks, taken from a distance with a long lens. Aaron never learned the full details of the investigation that followed. He was not a detective. He did his part, first on scene, onto witness documentation, and then it moved up the chain. What he did eventually hear through the informal network of gossip and hallway conversation that runs through every law enforcement office was that the subject of the notebooks had been located. They were alive. They had no idea any of this existed. Gerald Mast had never made contact with them as far as anyone could determine. He had simply watched. For years, he had built a bunker in a basement that didn't officially exist. He'd stocked it with supplies, and he had watched. What he had been waiting for, what the endpoint of all that watching was supposed to be, died with him. Aaron Sykes requested a transfer to days 6 months later. He told his wife it was for the family schedule to be home more in the evenings. He never told her about the basement lights that had burned for 3 weeks over a dead man's notebooks, or about the way he still sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark, wondering whether Gerald Mast had ever been the only one doing the watching. Story 2. The Last Call. Officer Dana Reyes worked the overnight shift in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. She had a reputation among her colleagues for being composed. Not cold, but the kind of steady that you wanted beside you when a call went sideways. Her sergeant had told her more than once that she had the best instincts on the night shift, the ability to read a situation before it fully declared itself. It was that instinct that made the call on March 4th so hard to explain, because her instincts had told her something was wrong. She had just been wrong about what? The call came in through dispatch at 2:47 a.m., a welfare check. A woman named Patricia O. had called 911 and then the line had gone silent. Not disconnected, just silent. It's breathing. Open. Dispatch had tried to talk to her and gotten no response. The address was a second-floor apartment in a quiet residential building about 10 minutes from where Dana was already running patrol. She arrived at 2:54 a.m. The building's front entrance was propped open with a brick. Not unusual. She took the stairs to the second floor, found apartment 2C, knocked, announced. Nothing. She tried the door. Locked. Building manager. She called down to dispatch to get the building manager's number, then stood in the hallway and listened. The hallway was silent. No sound from inside the apartment. She pressed her ear lightly to the door and thought she could detect something. A faint sound, rhythmic, like breathing, or maybe just the HVAC. She couldn't be sure. The building manager, a man named Dennis, arrived in a bathrobe and slippers, annoyed and half asleep, and let her in with his master key. Dana entered with her hand on her holster. The apartment was small and tidy. Living room, kitchen, bathroom, one bedroom. A lamp was on in the living room. Dana cleared the kitchen and bathroom first, then moved to the bedroom door, which was half open. Patricia was sitting on the edge of her bed. She was in her pajamas, a grown woman, maybe 40 years old, and she was holding her phone in both hands in her lap and staring at the wall. She was breathing. She was physically unharmed. She turned to look at Dana when Dana entered the room, and her expression was, Dana later struggled to describe it to her sergeant, not blank, not frightened, something in between, like a person who had just witnessed something and had not yet finished deciding how afraid to be. Dana knelt in front of her and spoke quietly. Patricia, I'm Officer Reyes. Are you okay? Did someone hurt you? Can you tell me what happened? Patricia looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, There was a man in my apartment. Dana's hand went back to her holster. She had already cleared the apartment. She cleared it again, faster this time, every closet, under the bed, behind every door. Nothing. She confirmed with Dennis that there was no other exit from the unit except the front door and one window in the bedroom that opened onto a fire escape. She checked the fire escape. Empty. She checked the window. Latched from the inside. She came back to Patricia. Can you describe him? Patricia described him. White male, maybe 60, gray hair, wearing a dark jacket, average height. She said she had woken up at roughly 2 a.m. to get water, and he was standing in the kitchen, just standing there in the dark. She said she screamed, or tried to. It came out as barely anything, and grabbed her phone from the nightstand and called 911 and then couldn't speak. She said she'd heard him moving in the apartment while she sat on the bed. She'd heard the front door, she thought, but she wasn't sure. Dana took the report. She checked the front door lock. No signs of forced entry. She checked every window. Everything was secured. She got Patricia a glass of water, sat with her until she'd calmed down, and arranged for a female officer to stay until morning. She filed her report. Welfare check. Complainant reports intruder. No suspect located. No evidence of entry. She thought about it on the drive back. The locked windows. The latched fire escape. The door that had required a building manager's key. She wrote it off, the way you sometimes have to. Sleep paralysis. A dream that felt real. A woman who had been frightened in the night by something her brain had generated and then insisting on its reality because the fear was real even if the source wasn't. It happened. It was the most logical explanation. 6 days later, Dana got a call from one of the detectives in her division. He asked her about the welfare check on March 4th, where she confirmed she'd taken it. He asked her if she had checked the building's utility basement. She had not. It had not seemed relevant. The detective told her what building maintenance had found that morning when they went to check on a boiler issue. In the utility basement, accessed by a door in the building's first-floor hallway, completely separate from the residential units, They had found evidence that someone had been staying there for an unknown period of time. A sleeping bag of food wrappers, a small battery-powered lamp, and tucked into a gap in the insulation behind the boiler, a ring of keys. Master keys to the building, specifically master keys for the residential units. They had not yet determined where those keys had come from. Building records and key logs were being pulled. Dana thought about the latched window, the locked door, the way a building manager's key had been required to get inside. As she thought about the fact that she had cleared the apartment and found nothing, and then she thought about the question she had never asked, had never thought to ask, which was not whether the man had still been inside the apartment when she arrived, but whether he had known she was coming. Dana ran the patrol car route in her head. Dispatch to arrival. 7 minutes. Plenty of time. She never found out who he was. Yet the keys were traced to a locksmith who had no record of the transaction. Cash paid to a former employee who had since moved out of state and was never formally interviewed. Patricia Wu moved out of the building within the month. The case stayed open. Dana still works the overnight shift. She's still known for her composure, but she now makes a habit, when she responds to a welfare check, of checking every exit first and asking herself not where a person might hide, but where a person might wait. Story 3. Mile marker 41. Trooper Ben Callahan worked highway patrol on a stretch of state road in rural Montana that most people drove through without stopping. Scrubland on both sides. The nearest town a thin scatter of buildings 12 miles east. And almost nothing for 30 miles in either direction except flat land and the occasional cluster of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed. It was the kind of road where you could drive for 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle. The kind of road where, if something went wrong, it went wrong alone. He had worked that stretch for 6 years. He knew every mile of it the way a person knows a room they've lived in for a long time. By feel, by the particular quality of the light at different times of day, by the specific mile markers and the small landmarks that don't appear on any map. Mile marker 41 was where he found the car. It was a November night, fully dark by 5 in the afternoon, and Ben was running westbound at around 9 p.m. when his headlights swept across a vehicle parked on the shoulder just past marker 41. A silver sedan, engine off, hazards not on. He ran the plates as he slowed down. The car was registered to a woman named Claire Ellison, 32 years old, address in Billings. He pulled in behind it and got out. The car was empty. No sign of mechanical failure, no flat tire, nothing obviously wrong. The windows were fogged slightly on the inside, which meant the car had been occupied recently. The driver's door was unlocked. On the passenger seat was a purse with the wallet still inside, a phone with a cracked screen and a dead battery, and a paper coffee cup from a gas station chain, still faintly warm. No sign of Claire Ellison. Ben swept his flashlight along the road in both directions, then off into the scrubland on both sides of the shoulder. And the land was flat and open. Not much cover except for the dry creek bed about 100 yards north, marked by its crooked line of cottonwoods, leafless this time of year and thin against the dark sky. He called it in. Abandoned vehicle with recent occupancy. No visible occupant. He requested backup and began a perimeter sweep on foot, which is protocol. He moved north toward the creek bed because that was the only logical place a person could be, the only cover, the only feature in an otherwise blank landscape. He was about 50 yards from the tree line when his flashlight caught something. A shoe. One shoe. Lying in the dry grass, a woman's sneaker, laces still tied. He stopped. He swept the flashlight outward in a slow arc. The grass was trampled in a rough path leading toward the creek bed. He moved forward carefully, calling out, "Claire Ellison, this is Montana Highway Patrol. Are you injured?" "Nothing." He reached the tree line. The cottonwoods were maybe 20 trees, sparse and bare, their branches catching the edge of his flashlight and throwing thin shadows across the dry creek bed below. He moved along the bank, sweeping his light into the bed. It was 4 feet deep here, the bottom sandy and littered with dead leaves. He almost missed her. Claire Ellison was in the creek bed, half hidden under the overhang of the bank. Yankee pressed into the shadow with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around herself. She was in jeans and a light jacket, nowhere near enough for a Montana November night. When his flashlight found her face, her eyes were open and she was staring directly at him. But she didn't speak, and she didn't move. He climbed down into the creek bed and crouched in front of her. Her lips were bluish. She was shaking hard. He shrugged off his patrol jacket and put it around her shoulders. And she flinched at the touch. A full-body flinch, like a person who's been expecting pain. "Claire, I'm Trooper Callahan. You're safe. Can you tell me what happened?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Is he gone?" Ben looked back toward the road. His cruiser's lights were still going, the reds and blues sweeping out across the flat land. Nobody else visible. "Is who gone?" She shook her head. She didn't want to say, and she was still staring past him toward the road. Ben got her back to his cruiser, got the heat going, got a blanket from the trunk. Backup arrived 15 minutes later. 2 units, plus eventually an ambulance from the nearest town. While the paramedics assessed Claire for hypothermia, Ben walked the scene again with the second trooper, a woman named Danny Fair, who'd been on the highway 3 years. They found the footprints on the second sweep, but further east along the road, on the opposite side of the highway from where Claire's car was parked, in the soft dirt of the shoulder. Large boots, deep tread. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while, based on the depth of the impressions. Standing there in the dark on the shoulder of a highway in rural Montana, with nothing around them for miles, facing the car. Claire told her story in pieces over the following days, as she warmed up and the shock receded, and she'd had a slow leak in one of her rear tires. Nothing dramatic, just the car handling wrong, and had pulled over at marker 41 to look at it. While she was out of the car, another vehicle had stopped about 100 feet behind her. No headlights. A man had gotten out. He hadn't said anything, hadn't called out to offer help. He just stood beside his car and watched her. She'd gotten a bad feeling, the kind she said she'd been taught her whole life to second guess, used to not be rude about, but she listened to it this time. She grabbed her purse and started walking toward the cottonwoods because it was the only cover she could see. She heard him following. She got into the creek bed and pressed herself under the bank, and he had walked along the top of it. She had heard his feet in the gravel directly above her head, but he hadn't looked down, or hadn't been able to see her in the dark, or had made some other decision she didn't have a name for. She had heard him walk back toward the road. And then silence. For how long, she wasn't sure. long enough that she'd stopped shaking from fear and started shaking from cold. She didn't move because she didn't know if he was still there, standing somewhere in the dark between her and her car. He was, in fact. The footprints on the shoulder confirmed it. He had stood there, across the road from her car, in the dark, with no lights on, for long enough to leave impressions the depth of someone who had settled their weight in. And then at some point before Ben arrived, he had gotten back into his vehicle and driven away. No plates. Claire hadn't seen them in the dark, and no traffic cameras covered that stretch of road. The vehicle was described only as a dark-colored truck or large SUV. The case was never solved. It may never be. In the strict legal sense, no crime was committed. A man stopped on a highway and stood on a shoulder and then left. There's no law against that. Ben filed the incident report, and it went into a database, and that was largely the end of it, officially. What Ben has never been able to stop thinking about, and he will tell you this if you ask him, though he's not one for talking about work off the clock, is the footprint depth. He's worked that highway for 6 years. He knows what it means when someone settles their weight like that. He was waiting to see if anyone would come for her. When the lights of Ben's cruiser appeared on the horizon, the man had gotten in his truck and driven away. Ben still works mile marker 41. He still knows every inch of that road. But these days, when he's running westbound in the dark, he finds himself scanning the shoulders before his headlights reach them, looking for the shape of someone standing very still.